Dr. Heidi Beirich is the Chief Strategy Officer and co-founder of the Global Project Against Hate and Extremism. It's a fantastic organization of experts who monitor and fight radical extremism. Heidi has been in the trenches for decades and is one of the world's premier experts on investigating and countering hate movements. Heidi, welcome to the Wayne Besen Show.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for having me, Wayne.
Your organization said that 2022 midterms are shaping up to possibly be the most dangerous and volatile of any in recent memory. What led you to this assessment?
Well, I think the facts are already there on the ground. We've seen voters in Arizona, for example, being threatened at drop boxes by heavily armed men just in the last week. But the reason for this is that there's an injection now of white supremacist organizations, other kinds of extremist organizations who have taken up election denialism or various ways to essentially mess with poll workers, election infrastructure, and voters in a way that was not the case before. And as extremist groups have, become almost mainstream from the right, they have, signed on with GOP factions in various states to engage in this election in a way that has just not been there before. And it's really quite scary because a lot of these groups have records of violence or connections with their propaganda to violence. And so voters are facing a landscape, and election workers are facing a landscape that is shocking and new and very unfortunate.
The far right hate groups, particularly white supremacists, have long wanted a civil war. And they're not so fond of democracy because they don't win when people come out to vote. That seems to be at the center of their support with the Republican Party. But what concerns me is they might be the dog that catches the car, and suddenly Republicans are going to find themselves in a situation where democracy can't exist. How did this go from these fringe groups in these musty basements to the mainstream, where one of our political parties has embraced them hand in hand?
Well, you can put a lot at the feet of Trump, right, for sort of ripping down the barriers around racism and hatred of all kinds, right? We all remember when he was on stage at one of those presidential debates and said to the Proud Boys, stand by, essentially. He plays a role, but it's not just Trump. The party itself has caved on racial issues, right? Immigration has gone completely hardline. Racism towards immigrants is said is so often by candidates running for office right now on the GOP ticket, it's shocking. The idea of the great replacement, right? This white supremacist conspiracy theory that white people are being intentionally replaced. Sometimes that's blamed on Jews, right? Or global elites. That is now a campaign issue for dozens and dozens of candidates. And it's also the mantra of every white supremacist group out there, including a group like the Proud Boys. There doesn't seem to be any daylight anymore with the Republicans and this kind of extremism. And that's what's different today. You used to be able, even when the Republicans would dog whistle on race, to sort of name and shame the worst actors out of the party, right? They would turn their backs on them, not let them run for office. I always think of George Allen running for Senate in Virginia in 2006 and using a slur word for black people, and he was done. Well, that doesn't happen anymore, right? And I think we need to sort of call this for what it is, which is one of our major political parties has moved so far to the right that there is no daylight sometimes between them and other, things that we used to consider fringe extremists.
You mentioned anti-Semitism, and Kanye West has been in the news lately for trumpeting anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. This encouraged a white supremacist group in Los Angeles to hang an anti-Semitic banner over a highway. And then we've had Donald Trump, who talked about Jews in Israel, trotting out old anti-Semitic tropes. It seems like anti-Semitism has really increased during this election cycle.
Yeah, I would say that that's exactly right, Wayne. We have seen anti-Semitism bubbling up in ways that we didn't used to in this kind of blatant thing. I have to say the banners in Los Angeles were, you felt like you were back in Nazi Germany or something. It was very, very creepy.
Yeah, it was it was really, as a Jewish person, it was very disconcerting. It does seem all of a sudden like these things that were taboo are out in the open again.
I have to say I've had far too many conversations in the last couple of weeks talking about the 1930s, actually, right? This feeling like there's a complacency on the right towards the rise of extremism, how dangerous it is. And that's what happened in Germany, too, in the 1930s, right? There was no one to stand up against all of this. Anyhow, The Great Replacement, I think, is part of the reason we're seeing more anti-Semitism in common discourse, because Jews are often blamed for that. But the QAnon conspiracy, which 1 in 4 Republicans apparently believes in, according to polls, is also deeply
which is
anti-Semitic.
amazing.
Yeah, it's shocking.
I mean, this is actually a movement that believes that Democrats are satanic, and it's a cabal that molests children and even eats babies. I mean, the fact that that many Republicans believe in this is it's really mind-boggling. I mean, I never really put much stock in some of these right-wing conservatives because they've lied about a lot of issues, from gay rights to abortion, but this is a whole new level. I mean, this is just bizarro world, and that's what makes it scary. It's out of touch with reality.
Yeah, and it's a revival of the blood libel, right? This idea of eating children, sort of the oldest anti-Semitic trope that exists. It is scary. It almost seems delusional, right, that those kinds of numbers could believe that. More than 50% of Republicans believe the Great Replacement is real, which it is not. I don't really understand how we could descend so quickly into this place, but, here we are. And like I said, I blame Trump for it, but there's obviously been, a lot of white supremacy, hatred, cultural concerns bubbling out there that he was able to tap into, that have now sort of organized themselves under the banner of the GOP. There's no other way to say it.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is people for a long time have suffered economic distress. At first, they harmed themselves, whether it be opioids or drinking or depression, what have you. We've seen deaths of despair, and then people were looking for a narrative to explain their situation in life, their downward mobility. And then you had someone like Trump come along, and Fox News, these hate entrepreneurs who profited from this and pushed this. And people said, oh, yes, they have answers. There were scapegoats. There are others who were responsible for my pain and my plight. And I think that's how we got here. And I think it's an old story. We've seen it over and over again throughout the world. Opportunists who look for scapegoats to create a narrative where people can explain why they aren't in a better place in life. And the Republican Party is running a lot on that now. And crime, for example, is one issue that they're exploiting. There's a lot of racism in that. We saw it with Senator Tuberville. And racism in this campaign, I mean, have we seen, what have you seen in terms of racism and race baiting in this election cycle?
Well, unfortunately, we're seeing every kind of bigotry and hate play a role here, right? Tuberville's comments were just blatantly racist. We're seeing attacks on Jews, attacks on the LGBTQ community, with like these wild accusations around drag shows and groomers, attacks on trans kids, the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida. To me, in a way, the Republican agenda is nothing like the Republican Party from years ago, where they used to talk about taxes and things like that. What they're doing is race baiting on crime, on immigration, and essentially demonizing a whole bunch of communities to rally their base. And you're right, this is an old story, right? There have been so many movements in human history that do this exact same thing to build power, including the Nazis, obviously. And it's not really, it's just an agenda of hate that we're seeing. That's what it is, to get people out to vote. And my biggest concern is you mix that in with election deniers, and if a bunch of them win in these midterm elections, then our democratic framework's going to come crashing down too. And then I don't know what you do.
And I'm concerned internationally because we have the war in Ukraine, and Ukraine, as far as I'm concerned, is the front line of fighting for freedom. But we also have winter coming up, and there's fuel shortages, and we already see far-right parties gaining strength, exploiting this. And by the way, they love Russia because it's authoritarian. So we could actually see some far-right parties in Europe gaining traction over the next few months if it's a harsh winter. We already saw in Sweden and Italy, for example, fascist parties that have risen. This must concern you as well.
It's, I think, quite terrifying, right? These are major economies, right? Sweden. Well, really, it's now Poland, Hungary, Italy, and Sweden that are run by far-right parties, some with, in Sweden's case, ties directly to Nazis. And you have the rise of far-right constellations in almost every single country in Europe, whether it's Vox in Spain or the far right in France, the Front National and affiliated parties. And there is a possibility that Europe's future is going to be determined by these groups, people like Giorgia Meloni, and not by people who are committed to democracy. And their agenda is an anti-rights based agenda, right? They want to have an illiberal democracy. I mean, I don't really think you can consider Hungary anymore under Orban, and the EU Parliament just voted to say this, as an actual democracy. It's not. And the tide against democratic systems is so fierce right now. It's foreboding.
Which is interesting because in countries that actually have authoritarianism, they are now striving to be free. We look at the women in Iran fighting against the Ayatollahs and wanting to not be told what to wear. And we look at the people in Russia. 300,000 just fled Russia because they didn't want to be sent to Ukraine. So these authoritarian countries aren't doing so well. China with their COVID policy. So actually in countries that do have these authoritarian governments, people are not happy. But yet in the West, there is a large number of people headed in this direction. Speaking of the Ukraine war and the battle for democracy and human rights, Russia has joined with the most odious regimes in the world. Iran, North Korea, Saudi Arabia. How would Ukraine defeating Russia impact the global fight against hate and extremism? Because Russia's been funding a lot of these neo-Nazi groups in the United States and Europe, and also trying to impact elections.
It would have a big impact, I think, both for freedom and democracy, right? To remind people what is on the line here. And it would push Russia back on its heels. And you're right. They host, for example, the head of the base, one of the most dangerous transnational neo-Nazi groups in Russia. The Russian Imperial Movement, another one, a similar kind of group, is, headquartered out of St. Petersburg. It would leave a mark, right? And it would distinguish, maybe it would even remind those people who've been voting for the far right in Europe about the value of democracy and freedom, that it's actually something that we have fought very hard for over the years to get, and he shouldn't be handing it away so easily and demonizing populations in the way that's happening with these parties.
Yeah, and Ukraine is a perfect example. I mean, they're giving their lives in blood to defend democracy and to join the West. And yet you have so many people here willing to just throw away everything that we have fought for in all of our wars. And it's very disheartening to see that. Back to the United States elections, we have these poll watchers. Some of these are a bunch of angry thugs who are going out to intimidate and harass people when they go to vote, the most basic part of democracy, voting. And people are scared. How much do these poll watchers concern you?
I think we should all be quite concerned. The Department of Justice opened basically an election integrity investigative unit a few months ago because they were already seeing these kinds of attacks. We had we shouldn't forget, in 2020, poll watchers and election workers were already facing threats coming from election deniers, Trump acolytes, and so on. That was already happening. It's just getting worse now. Voters are going to feel quite scared, I think. My organization did a poll recently and found in particular that young people, Latinos, and Black folks are afraid to vote because they're fearful of violence at the polls. And this is a vector, these poll workers, that could be a problem. But the other thing that's happening, for example, here in Georgia where I am, is these new voting laws have allowed people to just challenge voters. So people are showing up for early voting and being told, some random person who you don't know and doesn't know you has challenged your right to vote. You can't cast a ballot. Here's a provisional ballot. And that's scary too. And that's going to cause voter suppression, right? Because people are going to be like, what are you talking about? They're going to walk away from the polls. If we have a bunch of people with guns outside polls, and there's only 20 states that ban weapons at the polls, shockingly, that's another thing that's going to lead to voter suppression, right? All of these dynamics.
Well, I mean, that to me is stunning, but that is stunning to me that people can bring guns to intimidate people while they try to vote. That's outrageous that that's legal in any state. It is nuts. And what's going to happen is it's going to be an arms race, because if they actually pull this off this time and they're going to have a lot of people with guns, there'll be liberals, Democrats, other people coming to the next election with guns. And it's going to look like the Hatfields and McCoys. It's going to be insane.
Yes, I think that that's very, very possible. I think in other places you're going to have these heavily armed men, like you saw in the videos from these ballot drop boxes, standing outside the polling place, basically. And people aren't going to want to go in there and vote if they see that. And so there's going to be all these tactics create a natural voter suppression, especially for folks of color, right? That is going to trend in the way conservatives want. They don't want those people voting. And so they're going to scare the hell out of them.
Yeah, I'm hoping on some level it backfires and people say, screw this. We really do need to vote because if we don't, we're going to give power to people like this with the guns. Big tech and social media companies have been a disaster in many ways at fighting extremism. And also in many ways, they've exacerbated it. Have they been better in this election cycle or have they been as abysmal as usual?
They've been pretty abysmal. I will say the one thing that's different than 2020 is there are fewer big white supremacist groups and conspiracies like QAnon on the mainstream social media platforms. But that said, they have cut their election integrity teams down. I have no idea why. My organization was recently doing research on election denial organizations in the battleground states and nationally. And you look those organizations up on Facebook and Twitter, they're there. Their lies about elections aren't flagged. They're not marked in any way. So that kind of propaganda is just, free flowing. So no, they're not doing a good job. And, my God, the one thing they should at least get right is stuff around elections and voting. If somebody is going around saying the 2020 election was rigged and so will this one be, that's just a flat out lie. That shouldn't be given any kind of oxygen at all. And yet it's all over the damn place.
Yeah, I mean, I see it over and over again. They just let that big lie pass, or they challenge it in a very minor way, even during debates, when they should put the kibosh on it. They should squash it and say, you know what, that's just not true. That is a lie. That's not being partisan. That is not favoring one candidate over another. That's just basic fact checking. And I see a big failure with that. Marjorie Taylor Greene is now a rising star, believe it or not, in Republican politics. And she has embraced openly the term Christian nationalist. What does this term mean? And why should people be leery of it?
It is definitely something to be leery of. It's essentially a white-based movement that believes that this country should be run on the basis of a religious principle, right? It throws separation of church and state out the door. Any kind of other religions that exist in this country wouldn't have the equal rights of Christian nationalists. It's misogynistic, anti-woman, obviously anti-abortion, anti-LGBTQ, rabidly. It's sort of a fantasy of returning to an all-white 1950s domestic situation that you would have seen on TV at the time, right? And it's scary because it means limiting rights of many, many people. And Marjorie, besides her QAnon interest, she's horrible. How somebody like that has not been thrown under the bus tells you everything you need to know about the Republican Party today.
Yeah, I mean, in these born-again Christians, quite frankly, I mean, they're all, anti-gay. They're all about family values, and yet she's getting divorced now. They don't say a damn thing about that. Isn't that interesting? I guess they missed that part of the Bible because, Jesus doesn't mention homosexuality at all, but he's quite explicit. He doesn't like divorce. But I guess they missed that part of the Bible. They always seem to cherry pick.
They sure did that with Trump, didn't they?
Yeah, they sure did. Yes, you say if I've ever seen a family man, it's that one. Although, I mean, Herschel Walker is a family man. Unfortunately, it's many families. He just hasn't told us about them. In this show, I'm discussing a plan to introduce a bill in Idaho to ban public drag shows. This seems particularly totalitarian to me the more I think about it. I mean, the religious right wants to tell people what they can and cannot wear. That's like the Taliban. That's like Iran. I mean, how? Yeah, I mean, think about that. You cannot wear X. We're going to choose for you what you wear. I mean, they took away the right to choose for women in terms of reproductive freedom, and now they're going so far, they're so emboldened that they think they can say you can't wear this in public, which is really strange because, I mean, drag's been a very popular part of society, whether it's Tootsie, Milton Berle, and Bob Hope, and so on and so on. Americans have been laughing at drag shows forever, but suddenly they want to ban it. Talk about the rise of homophobia in these elections by Republicans and the use of anti-LGBTQ rhetoric in this campaign season. You touched on it earlier, but particularly going back to some of these old trips like grooming, which is basically calling gay people child molesters. It's disgusting, it's false, but they seem very emboldened more than ever to say or do anything right now. Nothing is beyond the pale. Nothing is too despicable or disgusting for them to throw out there.
I agree with you. I actually think the attacks on the LGBTQ community have been more insidious in some ways because they have leapt from just demonizing the community to actually trying to legislate away their rights. The Don't Say Gay bill in Florida is an example of this. The trying to ban drag shows, I don't even understand how that falls under how that works with the First Amendment.
Well, because if you have Clarence Thomas mediating the First Amendment in Alito, suddenly that's how it's permissible. But I mean, go on, and under any normal time, it's clearly a violation of the First Amendment.
But you're right. That's also a creepy thought, right? When we start thinking about what's happened at the Supreme Court. And then there's the issue of just demonizing trans kids, investigating the parents of trans kids, stopping them from having access to medical treatment that is sanctioned by the American Medical Association, medical bodies. This to me is even more than just saying terrible things about immigrants. You are literally trying to directly impact the lives of these people. And I think there was a drag show canceled in Florida, maybe today, yesterday, because so many threats were coming in. And we have seen Proud Boys in front of drag shows, which is terrifying. And restrictions on education, right? What you can talk about with the LGBTQ community, books. I mean, we're getting pretty close to the old Nazi book burning with this going on with targeting the gay community.
And the brown shirts. I mean, you just referenced that. What they're doing is they put out a false theory saying that drag queens are trying to recruit somewhere, or making up drag queens are gyrating naked, and which are lies. I mean, they've even doctored videos. And they put this out online, which then inspires the Proud Boys or some other thug group to go out to harass and intimidate and literally shut down these shows. Or Pride, for that matter. We've seen them go into Pride as well. I mean, this is a whole new realm where we saw this in Russia, where they would send these paramilitary types out to beat up gay people and trans people. And now we're seeing some of this at home right now. And that's a whole new level. We saw, God hates, gay people signs before. We've seen that, always. But this is outright physical violence, or the threat thereof.
It's calling out street thugs, right, to come and disrupt events. That is terrifying. And it's happening. And, Pride this year in June, there were so many threats against different parades, different events. And that's why I'm saying I think that the attacks on the LGBTQ community are at an even more, it's a direct personal level, right? It's hate crime stuff that's going on.
Yeah, but it seems very coordinated the way it's happening right now.
It is. They
use the internet to basically alert the local hate group of a local event, and then they show up there. And that is something that we associate, quite frankly, with Nazi Germany. I mean, that's what we saw with the brown shirts. And again, I wouldn't want to go that far that we're there, but we're certainly on that trajectory if this continues the way it is. Speaking of which, the Republicans could win the House and the Senate. If this happens, what will this mean in terms of hate, election denial, and outright extremism?
Well, I think a lot of Americans don't understand that we are really on the brink of losing our democratic system. If it's at the state level, if some of these election deniers get in who have said, I'm going to make sure Trump wins in 2024, or I'm going to pass a bill to, throw elections to the state Senate House, in other words, guarantee a partisan win. Well, we don't have a democracy then, right? That's the end of it. And if that happens, I'm not sure. It's almost hard to contemplate that this could happen, but it is actually on the table. Because if we lose that, right, of free and fair voting, we lose everything else. What are you going to do about civil rights? What are you going to do about human rights protections? What are you going to do about climate change? How are you going to even protest? How do you make your vote heard? None of that's going to be possible. And I really wish Americans understood what a knife's edge we're sitting on right now.
Yeah, it's frustrating that they don't.
Yeah. And if it goes the way you're talking about, Wayne, we're in serious trouble. We are going to look a lot more like Hungary in a few weeks than what we tend to think of America, democratically. And, I'm scared about this.
And I'm scared about 2024 as well, because if we get these extremists in there now, in roles like Secretary of State or governor, they have jurisdiction over elections. They can decide that the people's vote doesn't count and that right-wing legislatures are going to decide who wins. And when that occurs, what then? We have a constitutional crisis. It could really turn into violence. People are going to have to make a decision. Do I fight? Do I get in a ditch with a gun and fight? Or do I flee the country? or do I succumb and live under a dictatorship or an authoritarian regime? And I don't think people quite get where we're headed right now. And one of the reasons for this is the bubble, the media bubble. And we saw that on Fox with Kanye West. He made some horrible anti Semitic statements. He goes on Tucker Carlson on Fox. He says some despicable things. The American people didn't see it. It ended up on the cutting room floor. Fox went from just interviewing to being PR agents to whitewash bigotry. And there was a whistleblower, Fox would call him a mole, that released this footage. And I have a feeling that this has happened over and over again at Fox. And they try to airbrush the hatred and make some of the more extreme figures seem mainstream. What does this behavior actually say about right-wing media and their ecosystem, and how Republicans can skirt responsibility and hide behind this mask that Fox allows them to put on in other right-wing publications?
Well, a lot of us complain about social media, but pointing the finger at Fox is the correct direction. And some of the allied groups in the conservative ecosphere, I'm thinking of the Gateway Pundit and Breitbart and whatnot. They are the ones who have created the feedback loop, right, for their viewers about this. And I'm sure hate has hit the cutting room floor, but my God, the kinds of things Tucker Carlson will say, he's all about the great replacement, demonizing LGBTQ people. It is a disaster what Fox has injected into this country. People live in that bubble and they begin to normalize things that they would not have believed or said out loud at least 5 years ago, right? 6 years ago. So we should never forget the role that conservative media has played in radicalizing people. And Trump used it as his mouthpiece, right, to push these ideas out there too.
Any final thoughts as we head into the midterms?
I just really people go out and vote for democracy. That is my grand hope, because we cannot change anything else if we don't have that system. And then I really hope that this violence doesn't occur. I hope officials are on it, right? Protect voters so that they can go cast their ballots however they want to vote.
I would ask conservatives, I would ask those who back these election denying candidates, do you want to tell your children and grandchildren about how we used to vote in America? How there was once a time where we chose our leaders and they didn't choose us. And that is what is at stake. And these people mindlessly backing these MAGA candidates don't seem to get that. They're living in what they perceive as now, and they are jeopardizing the future of their own children and grandchildren. Thank you so much for appearing on the Wayne Besen Show. It's great to have you as always, and you offer so much insight into extremism. How do people find your organization? Where can they reach out and to learn about it?
Yeah, so our website's globalextremism.org. We're on Twitter at Global Extremism. You can find all of our work there. And thank you so much, Wayne, for having me. It's really a pleasure.